The morning sun hadn't yet risen when Tom Mitchell stepped out of his old pickup truck, his breath visible in the chilly October air. At 53, his weathered face told stories of countless days spent in these woods, each wrinkle a testament to years of early mornings and late evenings spent hunting in Blackwood Forest. He reached into the truck's bed, pulling out his trusty hunting rifle, the same one his father had given him on his 18th birthday. His hunting dog, Buddy, jumped down from the passenger seat, tail wagging with excitement. The chocolate lab's enthusiasm never failed to bring a smile to Tom's face, even on the coldest mornings. "Easy there, old friend," Tom whispered, patting Buddy's head as he adjusted his orange safety vest. The forest welcomed them with its familiar scents: damp earth, pine needles, and decaying leaves. Tom had been hunting these grounds for over 20 years, starting back when his son was just a baby. Now that same son had kids of his own, and Tom loved nothing more than sharing stories of his hunting adventures with his grandchildren during Sunday family dinners. As they walked deeper into the woods, Tom's boots crunched softly against the frost-covered ground. He knew every trail like the back of his hand. The crooked oak that marked the start of deer territory, the moss-covered boulder where he'd seen his first black bear, and the babbling creek where he and Buddy often stopped for water breaks. The pre-dawn silence was different today, though. Tom noticed it right away, his experienced hunter's instincts picking up on subtle changes in the forest's rhythm. Usually, the woods would be alive with the sound of early birds, squirrels rustling through fallen leaves, and the distant hooting of owls returning from their night hunts. But this morning, everything felt unusually still. Tom paused, adjusting the straps of his small backpack that carried his thermos of hot coffee and sandwiches wrapped in wax paper by his wife. She always packed him extra, knowing he'd share some with Buddy during their midday break. "Something feels different today, doesn't it, boy?" he murmured to his companion, checking his watch. Another family heirloom passed down from his grandfather. Tom decided to head toward his favorite hunting spot, a small clearing surrounded by thick brush where deer often grazed in the early morning light. The sky was beginning to lighten, painting the clouds in soft shades of pink and orange. As they walked, Tom reflected on how much these woods had changed over the years. Development had been creeping closer to the forest's edges, and he'd seen fewer deer each season. Still, there was something magical about Blackwood Forest that development couldn't touch. A deep, ancient feeling that seemed to pulse from the very earth itself. He remembered the stories his grandfather used to tell about these woods, tales of strange lights, mysterious animals, and ancient spirits that protected the forest. As a young man, Tom had dismissed these as just stories meant to entertain children. But after spending thousands of hours among these trees, he'd learned that forests held secrets that couldn't always be explained by common sense. The rising sun began filtering through the canopy, creating dancing patterns on the forest floor. Tom checked his gear one last time. His rifle was loaded but safety on, his hunting permit was in his vest pocket, and his small first aid kit was easily accessible. Years of experience had taught him the importance of being prepared for anything. Little did Tom know, as he and Buddy made their way deeper into the familiar woods, that this ordinary hunting trip was about to become the most extraordinary experience of his life. The forest seemed to hold its breath, waiting to reveal its ancient secrets to someone who had earned the right to see them through years of respect and dedication. The day was just beginning, and somewhere in the depths of Blackwood Forest, something incredible was waiting to be discovered. Tom Mitchell, the seasoned hunter who thought he knew these woods inside and out, was about to learn that some mysteries can't be tracked, some trails can't be followed, and some encounters can change a person's life forever. The morning fog hugged the forest floor as Tom followed a promising set of deer tracks. These weren't just any tracks. They were fresh, probably from less than an hour ago, and they belonged to what looked like a large buck. His experienced eyes could tell from the depth and size of the prints that this was probably the biggest deer he'd seen signs of all season. Buddy walked slightly ahead, his nose close to the ground, but something about his behavior seemed off. Usually eager and excited when tracking, the chocolate lab kept looking around nervously, his ears twitching at sounds Tom couldn't hear. "What's got you spooked, boy?" Tom whispered, patting his companion's head reassuringly. That's when he noticed the silence. In all his years of hunting, he'd never experienced anything quite like it. The forest, normally alive with countless sounds, had gone completely still. No birds called from the branches above. No squirrels chattered their morning complaints. Even the usual rustle of leaves in the wind had stopped, as if nature itself was holding its breath. The hair on the back of Tom's neck stood up. 20 years of hunting had taught him to trust his instincts, and right now, every fiber of his being told him something unusual was happening. He gripped his rifle a little tighter, though he kept the safety on. The weapon had always given him a sense of security, but somehow he knew it wouldn't help with whatever was causing this unusual silence. Through the corner of his eye, he caught a flash of white, brilliant white, like fresh snow in sunlight. His head snapped around, trying to get a better look, but whatever it was had vanished. Tom blinked hard, wondering if the early morning light was playing tricks on him. But Buddy had seen it too. The dog was now pressed against his legs, whining softly, his tail tucked between his legs. "Easy there, Buddy," Tom murmured, trying to calm both his dog and himself. He pulled out his thermos and took a sip of coffee, his hands slightly shaky. The hot liquid helped ground him, making the strange moment feel more normal. But as he screwed the cap back on, he saw it again, a large, white shape moving between the trees about 50 yards away. This time he got a better look. It appeared to be a dog, but unlike any he'd ever seen before. Its coat was a pristine, glowing white that seemed to shine from within, standing out starkly against the dark forest backdrop. The animal was massive, bigger than any dog he'd encountered, its movements graceful and deliberate, almost like it was floating above the ground rather than walking on it. Tom raised his binoculars, hands steady now despite his racing heart. But as soon as he focused on the spot where the creature had been, it was gone. Stranger still, when he lowered the binoculars and looked at the ground where the animal had stood, there were no tracks in the damp earth. Not a single paw print marked its passing. The temperature around him suddenly dropped, his breath coming out in visible puffs despite the morning having warmed up considerably since dawn. Buddy pressed closer, trembling slightly. The dog's reaction bothered Tom more than anything else. Buddy was usually fearless, having faced down angry raccoons, and even stood his ground against a young bear once. Tom reached for his phone, thinking he should take a photo if the creature appeared again. But as he pulled it from his pocket, the screen was black and wouldn't turn on, despite having been fully charged when they left the truck. He stuffed it back in his pocket, an uneasy feeling settling in his stomach. The buck's tracks, which he'd been following so eagerly just minutes before, no longer seemed important. Something much more significant was happening in his beloved forest. Tom had always scoffed at hunters' tales of strange encounters in the woods, preferring to trust only what he could see and touch. But now, standing in this unnatural silence with his frightened dog pressed against him, he was beginning to understand that some stories might have more truth to them than he'd thought. As if responding to his thoughts, another flash of white appeared, closer this time. Tom stood perfectly still, his heart pounding in his chest. The mysterious dog seemed to be trying to tell him something, appearing and disappearing like a ghost in the morning mist. And somehow, deep in his gut, Tom knew that following this strange creature would lead him to something that would change his life forever. The morning wore on, but time seemed to move differently in the hushed forest. Tom checked his watch again. Somehow only an hour had passed since their first glimpse of the mysterious white dog, though it felt much longer. His coffee had gone cold in his thermos, forgotten as he tried to make sense of what was happening around him. Each time the strange dog appeared, it seemed to grow larger. What had first appeared to be roughly the size of a German shepherd now stood as tall as a small horse. Its features had shifted too, becoming more wolf-like with each appearance, yet maintaining an otherworldly grace that no natural animal possessed. The creature's eyes, when Tom caught glimpses of them, seemed to glow with an ancient intelligence. Buddy, usually the most reliable hunting companion anyone could ask for, hadn't left Tom's side since their first encounter. The chocolate lab's behavior had changed from frightened to oddly respectful, as if he understood something about their mysterious visitor that Tom couldn't yet grasp. He no longer whimpered but watched attentively each time the white creature appeared. "What do you see, old friend?" Tom whispered to his dog, wishing Buddy could tell him what he sensed. The morning dew had burned off everywhere else in the forest, but wherever the white dog appeared, frost crystallized on the nearby leaves and grass. Tom could see his breath in these cold spots, even though the day had grown quite warm. He'd given up any pretense of hunting now. His rifle hung forgotten on his shoulder as he followed the appearances of the mysterious creature deeper into the forest. Tom realized they were heading into a part of Blackwood he rarely visited, an older section where the trees grew so thick that branches wove together overhead, creating a natural cathedral of leaves and filtered sunlight. The white dog seemed to be leading them somewhere specific. It would appear ahead of them, wait until Tom took a few steps forward, then vanish only to reappear further along what seemed to be a definite path. Despite his growing unease, Tom couldn't shake the feeling that this was important, that he'd been chosen for something, though he couldn't imagine what. His thoughts drifted to his grandfather's stories, the ones he dismissed as fairy tales when he was younger. The forest has its own guardians, his grandfather used to say, and sometimes, if they think you're worthy, they'll show themselves to you. Back then, Tom had laughed it off. Now, with each mysterious appearance of the white dog, those old stories took on new meaning. The air grew thicker as they walked, heavy with the scent of moss and ancient things. Tom noticed other changes too. The plants here seemed different, older somehow. Ferns grew chest-high, their fronds an impossibly deep green. The trees were massive, their trunks wider than any he'd seen before in these woods. Even the rocks seemed to belong to another time, covered in patterns of lichen that almost looked like writing. Suddenly, the white creature appeared again, closer than ever before. This time, it didn't vanish when Tom looked directly at it. Its coat shimmered with a light that seemed to come from within, casting soft shadows that moved in impossible ways. The being's eyes met Tom's, and in that moment he felt a connection to something vast and ancient, a wisdom that had watched over these woods long before humans had ever set foot in them. Buddy sat down calmly, his eyes fixed on the mysterious creature. The white dog, though Tom now knew it was something far more than just a dog, tilted its head slightly, as if listening to something only it could hear. The temperature around them plummeted again, and Tom watched in amazement as intricate patterns of frost spread across the forest floor, spreading outward from where the creature stood. Time seemed to stop completely. The filtered sunlight took on an otherworldly quality, and Tom could have sworn he heard distant whispers in a language he didn't recognize, but somehow almost understood. The white guardian took a step toward him, its paw prints leaving glowing marks on the ground that slowly faded like dying embers. Tom stood rooted to the spot, his heart pounding not with fear now, but with a strange sense of anticipation. He somehow knew that everything in his life, every early morning in these woods, every lesson learned from his grandfather, every patient hour spent teaching his own children about nature, had been preparing him for whatever was about to happen next. The white guardian led Tom through a series of ancient trees, their trunks wider than his truck. His boots crunched softly on fallen leaves, though he noticed the mysterious creature made no sound at all as it moved. The morning sun barely reached through the thick canopy here, but the guardian's gentle glow provided enough light to see by. Following what he thought was the creature's trail, Tom pushed through a curtain of hanging moss and stopped dead in his tracks. There, in a small clearing he'd somehow never discovered in all his years of hunting, stood a stone marker unlike anything he'd ever seen. It rose about chest high from the ground, its surface covered in strange symbols that seemed to shift and change when he wasn't looking directly at them. This can't be real, Tom whispered to himself, reaching out to touch the stone. His fingers met cool, rough granite, solid and undeniably real. Buddy sniffed around the base of the marker, no longer showing any signs of fear. The stone itself seemed to pulse with a faint blue light, growing stronger whenever the white guardian appeared nearby. Tom pulled out his handkerchief and gently wiped away some of the moss covering the strange symbols. They weren't like any writing he'd seen before, not the Roman letters he knew, nor the Native American petroglyphs he'd seen in books. These symbols seemed older somehow, as if they'd been carved when the world itself was young. The white guardian now stood at the edge of the clearing, watching. In this space, it appeared even larger, its form more clearly wolf-like, but with an elegance that no earthly wolf possessed. Its eyes glowed with the same soft blue light as the stone marker, and for the first time, Tom noticed patterns in its fur that matched some of the symbols on the stone. As he studied the marker, the temperature dropped again, but this time it felt different. Instead of the sharp cold that had accompanied the guardian's earlier appearances, this was a gentle cooling, like stepping into shade on a hot summer day. The air around him seemed to thicken, and the sounds of the forest faded away completely. Tom's head began to swim, not unpleasantly, as if he was fallen into a dream while still standing. The symbols on the stone began to glow brighter, their light pulsing in rhythm with his heartbeat. He felt Buddy press against his legs, a reassuring warmth in the growing coolness of the clearing. Without warning, images flooded his mind. He saw the clearing as it had been hundreds of years ago, watched as native hunters performed sacred ceremonies around this very stone. They wore clothing made of deerskin, their faces painted with symbols that matched those on the marker. And there, watching over them just as it watched over Tom now, stood the White Guardian. More visions came faster now. He saw the seasons change in moments, winters and summers flashing by like pages in a book. He saw how the people of the past had lived in harmony with the forest, taking only what they needed and always giving thanks. He saw how they respected the White Guardian, understanding its role as protector of these sacred grounds. But then the vision shifted, showing him something more urgent. He saw dark clouds gathering over the nearby town, watched as water levels rose far beyond anything in living memory. The images were crystal clear, streets he recognized would soon be underwater, houses he knew would be in danger. The White Guardian was showing him what was coming, trusting him to act on this knowledge. Tom's legs felt weak, and he found himself sitting on a fallen log near the stone marker. Buddy rested his head on Tom's knee, offering silent support. The White Guardian remained at the edge of the clearing, its presence both reassuring and commanding. This wasn't just about him anymore. He had been chosen to prevent a disaster. As his mind cleared, Tom noticed something else about the stone marker. The symbols seemed to tell a story, one that spoke of the connection between the people, the land, and the guardian spirit. He realized with sudden clarity that he wasn't the first to receive a warning from the White Guardian, but he might be one of the few who could still understand its importance. The morning sun finally broke through the canopy, sending shafts of golden light into the clearing. Where the sunbeams touched the stone marker, the symbols glowed even brighter, creating patterns of light and shadow on the forest floor. Tom knew he needed to act quickly. The visions of flooding had felt immediate urgent. But he also knew he'd been given a rare gift, a glimpse into the ancient magic that still lived in these woods, waiting for those who were ready to see it. The visions kept coming, each one clearer than the last. Tom sat on the fallen log, his hands gripping his knees as the stories of the past unfolded before his eyes. Buddy stayed close, his warm presence helping Tom stay anchored to the present as the ancient memories washed over him. He saw the first people who had lived in these woods, their lives so different from his own, but their love for the forest just as strong. They knew the White Guardian as the spirit protector, a being that walked between their world and the spirit realm. In their time, the stone marker had been the center of their sacred ceremonies, a place where they could communicate with the forest's spirits and receive warnings about coming dangers. Through these visions, Tom understood why he'd been chosen. The spirit protector had watched him over his 20 years of hunting in these woods. It had seen how he respected the forest, never taking more than he needed, teaching his children to do the same. He wasn't just a hunter here. He had become a part of the forest's story without even knowing it. The images shifted again, showing him more about the flooding that threatened the town. He saw how the spring's heavy rains had saturated the ground upstream, how the old dam was weakening under pressure he couldn't see. The vision showed him exactly where the water would break through, which neighborhoods would be hit first, and how much time they had left, less than a day. Tom's heart raced as he saw familiar streets underwater. He recognized Mrs. Chen's grocery store, old Mr. Wilson's hardware shop, and the elementary school where his grandkids went, all in the path of the coming flood. The spirit protector was trusting him with this knowledge because he knew these people, knew they would listen to him. The White Guardian moved closer now, its massive form graceful despite its size. Up close, Tom could see patterns in its fur that looked like flowing water, shifting and changing as it moved. Its eyes held centuries of wisdom, and when it looked at him, Tom felt a deep sense of responsibility settle over him. More memories flowed through his mind, not visions of the future this time, but stories of the past. He saw how the spirit protector had guided others before him, showing them where to find food during harsh winters, warning them of forest fires, helping them live in harmony with the land. The stone marker had been a meeting place between worlds for countless generations. Tom understood now why his grandfather had insisted on teaching him the old stories, why he'd been so adamant about respecting the forest's mysteries. The woods, remember, his grandfather used to say, and sometimes they choose someone to help them protect what matters. Those words made perfect sense now, sitting here in this ancient clearing with the spirit protector. The morning light had changed, taking on a golden quality that made the stone marker's symbols glow even brighter. Tom could read them now, not with his eyes but with his heart. They told stories of floods and droughts, of times when the spirit protector had intervened to save both the forest and the people who lived near it. Each symbol pulsed with its own light, showing him not just what would happen, but what needed to be done. He saw the exact roads that needed to be blocked off, which families needed to be evacuated first, and where the emergency services should focus their efforts. The spirit protector wasn't just warning him, it was giving him a complete plan to save the town. Buddy whined softly, bringing Tom's attention back to the present moment. The chocolate lab's eyes were fixed on the White Guardian, showing the same mixture of respect and understanding that Tom now felt. They weren't just witnesses to something magical, they had become part of an ancient tradition of protection and care. The air in the clearing changed again, becoming warmer, more urgent. Tom knew his time for visions was ending, now was the time for action. The spirit protector had shown him everything he needed to know. The stone marker's glow began to fade, its job complete, but the knowledge it had shared was firmly planted in Tom's mind. Standing up, Tom felt different, stronger, more certain of his purpose. He wasn't just a hunter anymore. He was now a guardian himself, chosen by an ancient spirit to protect both the forest and the town he called home. He looked at the White Guardian one last time, silently promising to honor the trust it had placed in him. Tom's boots pounded against the forest floor as he rushed back toward his truck, Buddy keeping pace beside him. The morning had grown dark, with heavy clouds rolling in exactly as he'd seen in the visions. Every rumble of distant thunder made his heart beat faster. They were running out of time. Getting people to believe him wouldn't be easy. How could he explain that a mysterious spirit in the form of a white wolf had shown him a vision of impending disaster? But as he ran, Tom remembered something his grandfather used to say, "When the truth matters most, speak it plain and simple." He reached his truck just as the first heavy raindrops began to fall. His hands shook slightly as he helped Buddy into the passenger seat, but his mind was clear. The spirit protector's visions had shown him exactly what needed to be done, and he knew who to talk to first. Officer Pete Brown had been his hunting buddy for 15 years. More importantly, Pete was on duty at the police station today. Tom's truck sprayed gravel as he sped down the forest road, rehearsing what he would say. He couldn't mention the White Guardian or the ancient stone, but he could tell Pete about the weakening dam he'd spotted during his morning hunt. The small police station came into view, its windows already streaked with rain. Tom burst through the door, water dripping from his hunting vest. "Pete," he called out, "we've got trouble coming. Big trouble." The officer looked up from his desk, concern spreading across his face at Tom's urgent tone. Tom laid it out simple and straight. During his morning hunt, he'd noticed signs of the dam straining under pressure. He talked about the saturated ground upstream, the unusual water patterns he observed, and the risks to the lower town. Every detail from the spirit protector's visions came out sounding like the observations of an experienced outdoorsman. Pete knew Tom's reputation. 20 years of hunting had taught him to read the land better than most. When Tom pointed out the exact neighborhoods at risk on the station's wall map, his finger tracing the same path the spirit protector had shown him, Pete's expression grew serious. "I've never seen you this worked up, Tom," Pete said, already reaching for his phone. "And you've never been wrong about the woods before." Those words set everything in motion. Within minutes, Pete was calling the fire chief, the mayor's office, and emergency services. The rain fell harder as they rushed to warn people, going door to door in the neighborhoods most at risk. Some folks were skeptical at first, but Tom's reputation in the community carried weight. When he told old Mr. Wilson that the water would reach his hardware store first, the urgency in Tom's voice convinced him to start moving his inventory to higher ground. Thunder crashed overhead as they helped Mrs. Chen pack her most valuable items from the grocery store. Her grandchildren helped carry boxes to safer locations, while Tom remembered the vision of her store underwater. Every person they warned, Every building they helped protect was exactly as the spirit protector had shown him. The elementary school was evacuated next, the children excited about their unexpected adventure as teachers calmly led them to the high school on higher ground. Tom's heart lifted seeing his grandkids among them, safe because of the warning he'd been chosen to deliver. Hours passed in a blur of activity. Emergency services set up barriers on the roads the spirit protector had shown him, though Tom simply called them likely flood routes based on his knowledge of the land. The local news picked up the story, broadcasting evacuation notices to the entire town. The sky grew darker still, and the rain fell in sheets. Tom's clothes were soaked through, but he kept going, driven by the responsibility the spirit protector had placed in him. Buddy stayed in the truck now, watching through the window as his master ran from place to place, making sure everyone was safe. Tom felt the moment the dam began to break, though he was nowhere near it. Something in the air changed, just as it had in the spirit protector's visions. He helped direct the last few families to higher ground, his voice hoarse from hours of warnings and explanations. Standing in the pouring rain, watching as the last residents moved to safety, Tom silently thanked the White Guardian. The water was coming, but thanks to its warning, no lives would be lost. The town would face damage, but buildings could be repaired. What mattered most? The people, their families, their children would all be safe. A week after the flood, Tom stood at the edge of Blackwood Forest, watching the sunrise paint the sky in shades of pink and gold. The town was slowly recovering, with neighbors helping neighbors clean up and rebuild. Though some buildings had been damaged, not a single life had been lost, a fact that filled Tom's heart with quiet gratitude. He wasn't alone this morning. Beside him stood Buddy, of course, but also a small group of people who had come to learn about the forest's history. There was Pate from the police station, who had believed him without question. Mrs. Chen was there too, her eyes bright with curiosity about the woods that had somehow warned them of danger. Even old Mr. Wilson had joined them, despite his bad knee. Most importantly, Tom had invited 2 local tribal elders who had reached out after hearing about what happened. When news spread about how Tom had predicted the flood, they recognized the signs of the spirit protector's intervention. Their ancestors had passed down stories about the White Guardian for generations, though few still believed them. The forest remembers, Tom told the small group, echoing his grandfather's words. And sometimes, if we're quiet enough, respectful enough, it finds ways to protect us. He led them along the trail, sharing not the full truth of his encounter, that would remain his secret, but the generations of wisdom about living in harmony with the land. The tribal elders nodded as Tom spoke, adding their own knowledge. They talked about how their ancestors had seen the White Guardian during times of great need, how the spirit had guided them through harsh winters and dangerous storms. Their stories matched perfectly with what Tom had seen, though he kept his own experience carefully wrapped in simple words about knowing the land. As they walked deeper into the woods, Tom noticed how differently he saw everything now. Every tree, every rock, every rustling leaf seemed more alive, more meaningful. He understood now why his grandfather had spent so much time teaching him about the forest's mysteries. It wasn't just about hunting or tracking, it was about being part of something ancient and ongoing. The group reached a clearing, not the one with the stone marker, which had vanished completely after that morning, but another peaceful spot where sunlight filtered through the leaves. Here, they sat on fallen logs while the elders shared more stories about the forest's guardians. The children who had come along listened with wide eyes, somehow knowing these weren't just ordinary tales. Tom watched as people began to see the forest differently. Mrs. Chen talked about changing her store's practices to be more environmentally friendly. Mr. Wilson offered to help create a local history display in the library, featuring both the flood and the older stories of the woods. Pete spoke about starting a forest preservation program with the police department. Over the following months, things began to change in their small town. More people took an interest in the forest's history, not just as a place for hiking or hunting, but as a living community they were part of. The tribal elders became regular visitors to schools, sharing their knowledge with a new generation. Tom often helped with these talks, teaching kids about respect for nature while keeping an eye out for those who might be ready to understand more. Buddy still accompanied Tom on his hunting trips, but they spent more time watching and listening than hunting now. Sometimes, in the quiet moments of dawn, Tom thought he caught glimpses of white fur between the trees or heard the whisper of ancient paws on fallen leaves. The spirit protector was still there, still watching, still protecting. Tom started a nature program for local kids, teaching them what his grandfather had taught him: how to read the weather in the clouds, how to spot animal signs, how to listen to the forest's warnings. He never mentioned the White Guardian directly, but he made sure they understood that the woods held deeper mysteries than most people realized. His grandchildren were among his most eager students. On quiet evenings, they would bake him to tell them about the day he saved the town. Tom would smile, remembering the spirit protector's eyes, and tell them the simple truth that if you respect the forest, it finds ways to help you when you need it most. Years passed, and the story of how Tom Mitchell predicted the flood became part of local legend. Some folks suspected there was more to the tale than he let on, but they respected his quiet way of telling it. What mattered wasn't the details of his experience, but what it had taught them all: that the connection between people and the land was ancient, powerful, and very much alive. The forest had changed Tom, and through him it had changed the town. As he sat on his porch in the evenings, watching the sun set behind the trees of Blackwood Forest, he would smile, knowing that somewhere in those woods a white guardian still walked, watching over them all, waiting for the next person ready to learn its ancient wisdom.